Hello and welcome to Heartlight Vedic Astrology. Today I was going to cover Kala Sarpa Yoga, planetary combination for ambition, and this is from a Vedic Astrology or Jyotish perspective. If you're new to Vedic Astrology or my videos, I have a bunch of teaching videos on the subject, and they're all in my concepts playlist, so you can find them all there. And whenever you see a double asterisk in one of my talks, that means there's a teaching video on that topic. Before this video, you might check out these others. I think you'll get more out of this talk if you look at these others. Northeast, South Indian, excuse me, North, South, and East Indian style charts. Introduction to navigating a birth chart. The Lagna, Ascendant, Rising Sign, First House. Those are all different names for the same thing. Introduction to the constellations or Rashis. The nakshatras or lunar mansions. Planet exaltation and debilitation or Ucha and Nicha. Planetary directional strength or Digbala. Lunar and solar eclipses, Chandra and Surya Grahan. Symbolism of different planets. I have a whole playlist on that. I have a video on each symbolism of each planet. And specifically for this talk, I would look at the videos on Rahu and Ketu. Or actually, there's one video on Rahu and Ketu together, so I would check that out. And then also, this video is part of my growing list of videos in my yoga playlist. And I have other yogas that I've talked about, such as Saraswati Yoga and Parivartana Yoga, which I'll actually be talking about in this talk as well. So a lot of background or a lot of learning potentially for you. All right, so what is Kala Sarpa Yoga? Let's talk about what that means first. So Kala means black or time, and Sarpa means serpent. So you can translate Kala Sarpa as serpent of time or black serpent. And Kala Sarpa Yoga is created by Rahu, the north node of the moon, and Ketu, south node of the moon. So Rahu and Ketu, Rahu is, there's a myth here related to these two planets where Rahu is seen as like the head of a snake and Ketu is seen as the tail of the snake. So Rahu is the Sarpa, kind of considered the Sarpa serpent part of this, and Ketu is seen more as like the Kala or kind of tail part of the snake. And a yoga is a planetary combination or that has special effects in a horoscope or birth chart. So just very, very briefly, if you want more about this, I would check out my video on lunar and solar eclipses because I tell the whole tale. But very briefly, the tale and this that kind of helps to remember the symbolism of Rahu and Ketu, what they do, and their energies. So there was this demon trying to steal the nectar of immortality back in the day. And so already just from that, there's a sort of sneaky, ambitious energy, right? And then the sun and moon found out about this demon trying to steal the nectar of immortality. So they reported the demon, and the demon was beheaded by Vishnu. And so when it was beheaded, the demon, which was kind of a snake, became the head of the snake and the tail of the snake. So these Rahu and Ketu are considered shadow planets or Chaya Grahas. Chaya means shadow, Graha means planet. And what Rahu and Ketu are known to do is they cause eclipses. Okay. So why do they cause eclipses? Well, Rahu and Ketu are still upset that the sun and moon reported them to Vishnu. So there's this sort of myth that Rahu and Ketu are endlessly trying to go after the sun and the moon and devour them. Okay, so there's that. So just from that part of the myth or additional myth, there's this energy of revenge and ruthlessness. I know this is already sounding dark, but hold on, it's not entirely dark. It doesn't have to be all dark. But in general, Rahu and Ketu, just as planets, have this are known for being hidden, shadowy, and the reason why they're called shadow planets is they don't actually have mass, and so they're not like Mercury or the Earth or something like that. What they are is they're actually calculations, and they're calculations for when the ecliptic of the moon crosses the ecliptic of the sun. And so those points, those actually calculations, are what form Rahu and Ketu. But getting back to the symbolism of Rahu and Ketu, there's this hidden energy to them, kind of unusual energy to them, intensity, ambition, drive, focus, possibly even obsession. And Rahu, because it's the head of the snake, is kind of this drive forward, and Ketu is the tail of the snake, is kind of this release of old things. Okay, so very simply, that's how you can think of Rahu and Ketu, and that's important for this Kala Sarpa yoga we're going to get into. Okay, so why is this not all dark? So far it sounds pretty sinister, perhaps, but the thing is, you can take ambition and drive and use it to create good things in the world. So it doesn't have to be all negative, even though there's this, I think, generally negative understanding of Kala Sarpa. It may be something to look out for sure, but again, as we get into this, you'll see there are all these different things you need to consider in the formation of Kala Sarpa to figure out whether somebody is truly deceptive, or if maybe they're looking like just a really ambitious do-gooder, like maybe somebody like Mother Teresa or something like that. Okay. And this picture on the side here on the right, this little snake actually happened across my path as I was walking, and this happened just during the last lunar eclipse. So that was pretty amazing, actually, that it's almost like Rahu and Ketu presented themselves to me during the eclipse. And what was also amazing was that I typically run away from snakes. I'm afraid of snakes, or snakes run away from me. So it's usually like one or the other, or both of us are both like flying away from each other. But we were both very calm enough that the snake just stayed there and let me take a picture. And I was calm enough to actually take the picture. And you can see it's like fairly in focus and close up. This is actually a very tiny snake. Um, yeah, so that was an unusual moment of connecting with snake energy for me. So I thought I would share that. I'm very proud of that moment. It's unusual for me. All right. So again, what is Kala Sarpa yoga? So let's move on from the symbolism of Rahu Ketu, although it's important to have that basis to understand this yoga. Kala Sarpa yoga is not mentioned in classical Jyotish, so it might be tantric. At least that's a guess by people who know more about this than I do. And there's a lot of confusion over its formation and its effects, which are very Rahu and Ketu like, because Rahu and Ketu are all about illusion, confusion, delusion, that sort of thing. So they're shadow planets. So there's a lot of, what's going on here? I don't quite know. I don't quite understand this. And that's very Rahu and Ketu. So according to my teachers, Kala Sarpa yoga is formed when you have all the planets on one side of the Rahu Ketu axis or the other. Because Rahu and Ketu, since the north and south node of the moon are exactly 180 degrees from each other. So there are times when you will actually get all of the planets on one side of this axis or the other. And you can see in this chart on the right here, I have Rahu and Ketu in the 6th and the 8th house. And there's that purple line, just so you are very clear about Rahu and Ketu, where Rahu and Ketu are. So if all very, if you're going with a very strict definition of this, when all of the planets are on one side of that line or the other, that means you have a Kala Sarpa yoga. Okay. The thing though, and so you can kind of think of, if Rahu is the head of the snake and Ketu is the tail of the snake, all the planets on one side are kind of in the belly of the snake. Okay, that might help to remember this. My teachers, though, they had a little bit looser definition of this. They would actually consider it to be a Kala Sarpa yoga if all the planets were on one side. Sorry, I just hit my mic. Hopefully that wasn't too loud. If all the planets were on one side of the Rahu Ketu axis, with the exceptions could be Moon and or Saturn, and it would still count as a Kala Sarpa. The reason why Moon and Saturn are not at least my teachers don't, necessitate them to create the Kala Sarpa yoga, is the moon moves so quickly day by day. I mean, it goes around the whole zodiac in about 27 and a half days. And Saturn is, on the other hand, Saturn is such a slow planet. It takes 29 and a half years to go around the whole zodiac. One so fast, it'll zip around. The other so slow. If you waited for, if you waited for all the planets to catch up to Saturn, because Saturn's the slowest moving one, you would almost never get a Kala Sarpa yoga. So that's what I use when I look at charts. Okay. So again, if Rahu is the head of the snake, you can kind of think of if all the planets are lined up and they're heading towards Rahu, and this is called anulom or normal kind of configuration. Rahu, the head of the snake, is going to eat all the planets as they go zipping by Rahu. Okay. And it's thought that when this formation, the anulom formation, is created, that this will this is a little bit easier to digest or as an experience for somebody than if it's in the other configuration, which is when all the planets are heading towards Ketu. And that configuration is called Vilom, or reverse configuration. And the thing is, again, it's not always a negative thing when, for example, the Vilom configuration is happening. It may give wealth, but there will be issues because, again, it's one planet after the other passing either Rahu or Ketu. And again, Rahu and Ketu are unknown, hidden, unusual. Medically, it's like things that are difficult to diagnose, things that are difficult to heal, because you can't kind of figure out what they are. So, um, so there can be a lot of ups and downs, like one crisis after another, if somebody has this Kala Sarpa yoga in their chart. Okay. The other thing is that you can increase the intensity of this, because it's not only when the planets pass Rahu and Ketu that there may be an issue, but a house is ruled by planets that are conjoined with Rahu and Ketu. So planets, if they're in the same house as Rahu and Ketu, then the houses that rule them, the planet that rules the houses that are ruled by the planet that are in the same constellation or Rashi as Rahu and Ketu. So in this chart, for example, I have Mars in the same constellation as Ketu. Okay. Mars happens to be in its own sign, okay, of Scorpio here, the 8th constellation. Mars also rules the first constellation of Aries, which in this chart is the 11th house. So since Mars is with Ketu, they're in the same constellation or Rashi. Houses ruled by Mars, which are the 6th house Scorpio and the 11th house Aries, they can be problematic because they're going to bring this sort of combined Mars Ketu energy with them. Yeah. So, and other points of intensity can be that the houses ruled by the disposer of Rahu and Ketu um, it can be disturbed or intense. So again, in this chart, Ketu is in Scorpio. Scorpio is ruled by Mars, which we mentioned. So just so any house that is ruled by Mars, so again being the 8th house, Rahu and Ketu are getting the better of me right now. So let me back up again. So the dispositor in this chart for Ketu is Mars. The houses ruled by Mars are the 6th house and the 11th house in this chart. The dispositor, or the ruler of the constellation in which Rahu is sitting, is Venus. And Venus rules Taurus, which in this chart is the 12th house. It also rules Libra, which in this chart is the 5th house. Okay. So, Mars, because it's with Ketu, is going to be problematic. It's going to be influenced by this Rahu Ketu energy. the houses ruled by the dispositors of Rahu and Ketu, in this chart happens to be Mars and Venus, are going to be disturbed. And then the houses that Rahu and Ketu are sitting in or occupy, so in this chart it's going to be 6 and 12, houses 6 and 12, these are going to have more of this Rahu, Ketu, Kala Sarpa yoga energy going on in them. Okay. So in this chart, the 6th house, for example, relates to things like enemies, obvious enemies, and the 12th house relates to things like hidden enemies. So already you can see there's going to be a lot of people coming out of the woodwork, probably trying to get in the way of whoever, if this was somebody's chart, right? And then you weave in other things. So Mars sitting there with Ketu, Mars is a planet that symbolizes enemies. And Mars, so you have a planet representing enemies and the house representing enemies, and you have Ketu, which is this sudden, unexpected, mysterious energy. You're gonna have all these people coming out of the woodwork you don't even expect, from this chart. And Mars's aspecting shines its light into the opposite house. So you're actually going to get this Martian enemy energy into the 12th house of hidden enemies. So this person, if this is somebody's chart, this is somebody who's going to have a ton of enemies, both obvious and hidden. And they're going to be pretty strong, pretty powerful enemies because Mars is in its own house. So Mars is very strong in its own house. So yeah, like, I don't know if this was somebody's chart. It might be they have the mafia running after them or something like that. Could be, if we're going to make up some simple stories here. All right. So again, there's a spectrum here. Again, if you're very tight with this definition of Kala Sarpa, you have to have all the planets on one side of the Rahu Ketu axis or the other. But again, if there's only Moon or Saturn on one side or the other, and all the other planets on the opposite side, I still take it as Kala Sarpa. And sometimes you get planets that are close to Rahu Ketu, like if it's a few degrees past Rahu Ketu, like if all the planets are on one side and Venus is just a few degrees past, I would still take it. Some people would call this, rather than a height, Kala Sarpa yoga, it'd be like Kala Sarpa like or Kala Sarpa-ish. So there's still usually plenty of energy. It may not be as intense as like a very strict Kala Sarpa, but I would still take it. Okay. So let's see. So the other thing, besides there being these areas of intensity related to the houses and rulers of the houses that Rahu and Ketu and their conjoiners are in, there are other things to consider. So in this chart, for example, where are the planets? Like in different, because they have different strengths and weaknesses in different houses or different constellations or Rashis. So in this chart, it happens that Rahu is in the 12th house. In this chart, the 12th house is ruled by Taurus. And Rahu and Ketu are both debilitated in Taurus. So that's going to destabilize Rahu and bring out more of the negative symbolism and negative aspects, negative qualities of Rahu in this 12th house of hidden enemies. And also expenses. The 12th house is also expenses and losses. It's also isolated places. Typically, what I see often when I see Rahu and Ketu on the 6-12 axis, like in this chart, a lot of people have a drug problem because Rahu and Ketu can symbolize poison and drugs and that sort of thing. So if somebody has Rahu or Ketu in the 12th house, and the 12th houses can have an energy of isolation, it can be people like to check out generally. Through drug use, for example. On the opposite side in this chart, Ketu is in Scorpio, and Rahu and Ketu are both exalted in Scorpio. So that means that Ketu is going to be super strong. So Ketu's exaggerated, Rahu's exaggerated in this chart because they're both really strong or really weak. And then on top of that, you have Mars with Ketu in its own sign. This is going to be a massively exaggerated Kala Sarpa. This is going to be a lot to deal with in somebody's chart, somebody's life. Okay, so knowing the exaltation, debilitation of these different planets, not just Rahu Ketu, is going to be another layer to add in and integrate into the interpretation. Then I started mentioning, like, what axis are Rahu and Ketu in? Well, the negative houses are typically seen as the sixth house, the eighth house, and the 12th house. So if you have Rahu and Ketu on the 6-12 axis, like you have here, that's going to stir things up. That's going to stir up the negative houses even more, just because of the energy that Rahu and Ketu bring to them. Yeah. Also the 2-8 axis, because the eighth house is, is pretty negative, or at least mostly considered negative, like death, chronic disease, bankruptcy, this sort of, that sort of thing is associated with the eighth house. So when you have Rahu and Ketu, Kala Sarpa along this 2-8 axis, that's usually not desirable. And the other thing is that when you have Rahu and Ketu, and again, this is just my observation and my thoughts. I wasn't taught this by anybody in particular, but when I see Rahu and Ketu on the 1-7 axis, that does kind of, it's memorable, because the thing is that um especially the first house, the Lagna, Ascendant, rising sign, those are all different names for the same thing. That is the first house. It picks up, exemplifies the personality and also the physicality of somebody, and it's kind of like a filter for the rest of the chart. So whatever's going on in the first house, excuse me, is influencing the rest of the chart. So if you have a Kala Sarpa on the 1-7 axis, that drive, ambition, intensity is going to be a very deep core quality of the person and their personality. So even if it's well placed, even if there are all these other beautiful planets around it, I would still think, when I see Rahu and Ketu in the first house, Rahu or Ketu in the first house, that this is going to be an ambitious person. Yeah. What else? Also, what nakshatras are Rahu and Ketu, and that makes a difference. So let's look at this K2 in the 6th house here in Scorpio. There are 3 different nakshatras in Scorpio. There's Vishaka, there's Anuradha, and then there's Jyeshta. And their energies are very different. So Vishaka nakshatra is a victory at all costs. The ends justify the means. So people who have really strong placements in Vishaka can be, again, ruthless. And just, me, I'm going to win, and I don't care who's collateral damage or what's collateral damage, blah, blah, blah. That's going to amplify all these negative qualities of Rahu and Ketu if there's a Kala Sarpa with Rahu or Ketu in Vishaka. Now, just after Vishaka is the nakshatra of Anuradha. Anuradha is victory, but victory through forming relationships and building bridges and collaborating and that sort of thing. Anuradha is a really great, very desirable nakshatra to be in. And so if Rahu or Ketu are in Anuradha, then it's like ambition through creating bridges and, like the UN maybe. I don't know. I haven't looked at the horoscope for the UN, but the UN seems like it could be potentially, like a Rahu Ketu and Anuradha type. Because it's, at least theoretically, the UN, United Nations, is all about forming bridges and collaborating and that sort of thing. I don't know if the actual day-to-day politics are like that, but at least on paper, that's theoretically what it's all about. Um, so yeah, so again, I didn't put in here the degree, so you don't know where K2 is in this chart, if it's in Vishaka or Anuradha, but that would make a big difference as to what is going to be projected through K2. Or what Ketu is going to be projecting, or again, what kind of confluence is happening between the nakshatra position and the Rashi position or constellation position of Rahu or Ketu. Other yogas. So in this chart, in addition to a Kala Sarpa yoga, there's also Saraswati yoga. So you got Jupiter in the second house, Venus in the fourth house, Mercury in the um, fifth house. That's a Saraswati yoga. Saraswati yoga is a planetary combination that indicates creativity, artistic ability, and education. So this might be somebody who's very ambitious artistically. So you can weave those together potentially. This chart also happens to have a Parivartana yoga. So hey, this chart, it was funny. I just kind of threw this together, and then when I started looking at it, I was like, "Oh wow, there's all this stuff going on." I didn't necessarily intend, but it's interesting nonetheless. That's a good example to learn from. So the Parivartana is happening between Venus and Mercury. Venus is in a sign ruled by Mercury, and Mercury is in a sign ruled by Venus. So you can swap those two planets. Um, uh, yeah, so that's going to make both of those planets strong because otherwise Venus is debilitated in the fourth, is debilitated not in the fourth house. Venus is debilitated in Virgo, but when you swap it, that's going to bring a lot more strength to Venus when it can get back to its own house. But if we're talking about, the next factor, again, there are many, but another factor to consider is the condition of all these planets. And in this chart, all these planets are exaggerated. They're either really strong or really weak. So again, that just sort of, I wasn't planning on it, but when all the planets fell where they fell, I was like, oh, this is actually pretty interesting, a useful chart to work with. So why are they all exaggerated? Well, if we go from the top and go around, going counterclockwise, Jupiter's in Cancer, that's exalted. Venus in the fourth house has Digbala, directional strength. That's going to make it strong, and it's not only a strength from the Digbala, but it's debilitated because it's in Virgo. So you have this mix of energies for Venus. That's exaggerated condition. You have Sun in Libra. Sun is debilitated in Libra. Mercury is going when you do the Parivartan exchange with Venus. That comes back to the sixth constellation or Virgo. So Mercury's in its own sign. That's going to be strong. And again, when you do the Parivartana, bring Venus into Libra, Venus is going to be in its own sign. So again, more exaggeration. Mars is in its own house. So that's strong. Ketu is exalted in Scorpio, strong. Saturn, it has Digbala, directional strength in seventh house. Moon, why is the moon exaggerated? Oh, the moon is right across from the sun, so that's it might be a full moon, a foolish moon, very close to a full moon when it's opposite signs of sun. So the moon's going to be full. That means the moon's going to be strong. And then you have Rahu debilitated in Taurus. So all these planets, this is going to be a very intense up and down, never a restful moment if this was an actual person's chart. The other thing in this is that I didn't put degrees, but if Sun, Mercury, Mars, Ketu, Moon, and Rahu are all pretty close to the first or last degrees of the sign, that means that we might actually be looking here at a lunar eclipse. um, so that would bring even more exaggeration and more integration of this energy. Yeah. Um, And another thing to consider, so any of the planets that are conjoined with Rahu and Ketu are considered malefic planets. Are the planets that conjoin or sit in the same house with Rahu and Ketu, are they benefic? In this case, with Ketu, you have the super strong Mars, but Mars is another malefic. So that means this sixth house is going to be pretty chaotic. Not only with enemies, but the sixth house also represents daily routine. So, daily routine. So this person, if this was a person, probably all over the place. Um, really erratic routine lifestyle was just what I'm seeing here. So anyway, that's what Kala Sarpa yoga is, at least the way I've learned it and the way I deal with it. And you can see how you integrate different pieces of information from the chart, like condition of planets and houses and that sort of thing, other yogas, to start getting an interpretation for a chart. So that's it for today. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate your support of my work. and what I do here on the channel, and you're interested in Vedic astrology. All of my teaching videos are in my concepts playlist. If you're interested in a personal birth chart reading, I do those on Zoom, and you can email heartlightastro@yahoo.com if you like one of those. I have another YouTube channel on natural medicine that includes other Vedic arts such as Ayurveda and yoga, as well as other paradigms of natural medicine like homeopathy and naturopathic medicine. And the name of that channel is Nature Source Care. So, as always, I hope you found this interesting and useful as you navigate the energy cycles of your life. And until the next one, take care. Namaste.